with mental health conditions. Our mission is to remove legal barriers to housing, healthcare, and income. And today we're all here to discuss a really important topic, specifically about veterans. We are going to be talking about racial identity and disparities in the military. We hope each of you leave today engaged and educated, committed to advancing veteran justice in Connecticut and also nationwide. I have the privilege and honor to be the moderator today, and we are honored to have some fantastic panelists. We have U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal here today, Richard Brookshire, the co-founder and executive director of the Black Veterans Project, Conley Monk, who's the director of the National Veterans Council for Legal Redress, and our own Leanne Brennan, who's the executive director of Connecticut Veterans Legal Center. To tell you a little bit more about the panelists, Senator Blumenthal originally was sworn in January 5th, 2011, and is serving in his second term as the U.S. Senator for the state of Connecticut. Senator Blumenthal served an unprecedented 5 terms as Connecticut's Attorney General, and his aggressive law enforcement for consumer protection, environmental stewardship, labor rights, personal privacy has reshaped the role of states' attorney generals nationwide and resulted in recovery of hundreds of millions of dollars to Connecticut taxpayers and consumers each year. Prior to his position as U.S. Attorney, Senator Blumenthal also served as administrative assistant to U.S. Senator Abraham Ribicoff, aide to former U.S. Senator Daniel P. Moynihan, when Moynihan was assistant to the President of the United States, and law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Harry M. Blackmun. Senator Blumenthal graduated from Harvard College and Yale Law School, where he was editor-in-chief of Yale Law Journal. From 1970 to 1976, he served in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves and was honorably discharged with the rank of sergeant. Senator Blumenthal lives in Connecticut with his wife, Cynthia, and their 4 children. We also are honored to have Richard Brookshire. He is the co-founder and executive director of the Black Veterans Project. Richard is advancing research, storytelling, and advocacy to address long-standing racial inequities across the military and the veteran landscape. His work and commentary have been highlighted by the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, USA Today, Rutgers Politico, CNN, and others. Richard is a former infantry combat medic and veteran of the war in Afghanistan and currently resides in Brooklyn with his miniature golden doodle bow. Conley Monk, we have the presence and the privilege to be here as well. Conley is a Vietnam War veteran who fought for decades to have his military discharge status upgraded and is a trailblazer still for so many. He is the co-founder and director of the National Veterans Council for Legal Redress. NVCLR is a Connecticut-based veteran service organization that connects veterans to social and legal services. NVCLR is particularly interested in upgrading the discharge status of veterans who receive less than honorable discharges. And finally, we have our very own Liam Brennan, who's the executive director of the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center. Liam comes to us from the New Haven Legal Assistance Association, where he worked in the Community and Economic Development Unit. Prior to joining New Haven Legal Assistance, he worked for the U.S. Department of Justice, where he served as a trial attorney in the Criminal Division's Fraud Section, an assistant U.S. attorney in the Financial Fraud and Public Corruption Unit in Connecticut, and directed the Federal Public Corruption Task Force in Connecticut. Liam is also a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School and serves on the board of Junta for Progressive Action. Today, we are going to speak to a whole bunch of panelists, and we are going to ask them some questions, and they're going to give us some insight on the federal and the state landscape as far as what racial justice and inequity looks like. Richard, we are thrilled to have you here today. Over the last decade, we all know that racial justice has come sharply into focus, but it feels like this movement is only starting to reach the military. Why is it important, Richard, to recognize racial justice and equity in the military? And what led you to start the Black Veterans Project?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you all. So the question, why is it important to address racial inequity and racism, racial discrimination, anti-Blackness? In the military. I look at the military as probably the most critical American institution. It stands basically in the way of tyranny. If it wasn't for the military, when we had the insurrection, who knows how, how our democracy would have transpired. And so I am deeply committed to the idea of ensuring that Black veterans or Black folk that serve have equal opportunity, protections under the UCMJ system, which is a separate legal system that has stark racial disparities and a long history of bad paper discharges that lead to something called benefit obstruction. So a lot of people on here, I imagine, might or might not know, but really starting all the way back in the Civil War, but kind of coalescing around World War II. Benefit obstruction around the GI Bill created a chasm in many ways when we talk about economic inequality even today, because Black vets largely didn't have access to the VA-backed home loans and also the education benefits in the subsequent years that followed. The economic devastation was carried forth. And so what prompted me to start the Black Veterans Project? About 3 years ago, I have a long journey, and we'll get into that, but I served for 7 years as a combat medic, and I'd always been interested in the realm of civil rights, and hadn't really looked at the military, though I knew that there were racial injustices present there. But being, on the later side of a millennial, I understood the power of the internet, and I realized that there were really no conversations within the media or even in the digital sphere around race in the military and racism amongst Black vets. And so I really wanted to cultivate a project that would bring this conversation online and have it provocatively and work directly with journalists and stakeholders and congressional leaders to propagate a reckoning of sorts. And over the course of the last 3 years, we obviously know things have built, and so we positioned ourselves well to be, a significant part of that effort. And so, yeah.
Richard, can you tell me a little bit about the national landscape and what the Black Veterans Project is doing to further, on a federal level, the inequities that have happened in the past?
Yeah, so there's one bill that hasn't been introduced yet, but it was announced in the 116th Congress. And it looks to provide GI Bill benefits to the direct descendants of Black World War II veterans. And I think for me, that is likely the most substantive piece of legislation that's kind of happening on the federal level. And like I said before, for those that aren't familiar with the GI Bill, it afforded those who had served during World War II access to VA-backed home loans, education benefits, vocational training. But because of redlining, because of discrimination in college admissions, vast Jim Crow laws, Black vets were largely locked out of those benefits, and it's had sustained economic repercussions in the decades that followed, specifically affecting the families who didn't have access to the housing stock that was afforded through the GI Bill, right? And we know that such a predominant way to build wealth in this country is to own a home and pass it down. So that I think is where our main focus is on the federal level relative to kind of a reckoning of the past. We're also working directly with Yale Law School, looking at racial disparities and benefit obstruction. Through the VA, we were able to deliver at the top of the year the largest race-based data query that the Department of Veterans Affairs has ever received, and we're currently in the process of getting some of that filled. We actually will be filing suit tomorrow morning against the Department of Veterans Affairs because they failed to fill all the FOIAs that we had delivered. So, and we know that they have the data. So it's a starting point to also look at a pathway for redress there when we talk about generational benefit obstruction outside of just World War II.
We have audience members that are different familiarities and what racial justice in the military and equity actually looks like. Can you walk it back for us a little bit and be really specific in the racial disparities that you have seen both as a veteran, as a service member yourself, and also the past disparities that we really are trying to identify in the military?
Well, I mean, that's a complex question to answer. I mean, racism and anti-Blackness, about critical race theory, it's a big conversation now in our country, but these things were codified into law and very much affected the ways in which American institutions operated, and that the military wasn't immune to that, right? We know that the military was the first American institution to integrate, but it did so out of necessity, really, because there was a depleting, force in World War II, and it was just more efficient to integrate the military. The majority of people in the military had an aversion to integration. And so what followed in the decades and decades, even with full integration with Vietnam, was what we saw to be a continued disparity amongst Black vets being funneled into the justice system within the military, and then thus being stripped of their benefits, right? So Conley, I'm sure, will speak to his experience with something similar, but this has been, part and parcel of the ways in which Black folk have been stripped of the benefits of service, right? Most folk join for educational, housing benefits, for healthcare, right? These are things that all Americans are fighting for, but you go, some were conscripted. I mean, the draft didn't end too long ago, and many of those vets are still alive. And so when we talk about addressing racial disparities in the military, we're really talking about making sure that the justice system in the military is addressed in a way that's equitable. And we also, as a project, look even more holistically, everything from recruitment practices to the type of jobs. We know that Black folk are generally relegated to service-oriented roles. There's a very diminutive presence of Black officers. Even with you guys have done a fantastic report a few months ago looking at the nominations processes for the military academies, which really end up feeding the kind of higher ranks of the military inevitably. And so there are multitudes, right? Just like in our general society, we have stark racial inequities. These things are present in the institution of the military. I think now we have a rising consciousness around the country that this institution can't be immune from the kind of reckoning that we're having as a larger society. And this focus on white nationalism, extremism, I will say, and I always say, it's always been there, and so I think it's a great thing that it's beginning to be reckoned with, but it's very, very complicated, right? Because the implications are there are many people who hold racist proclivities that exist at all levels in the military, unfortunately, and having that reckoning is not an easy one. It's not one that our country has gotten right yet. So. But it's necessary because when you think about the maintenance of a multiracial democracy, a democratic project, Black folk have to have equal opportunity. And so that's what we're fighting for.
Talk to me a little bit about what's going on in the justice system with the Military Justice Repair Act. So what's happened in the past and what they're trying to remedy with this, and how the Black Veterans Project is playing a role in that.
Yeah, sure. So how it has been shaped in the past, right? We have a system in the military, a rank and file system, a justice system that's kind of a carryover in many ways of monarchies past, right? And the military hasn't necessarily shifted to keep pace with modern changes. And you basically have complete command discretion amongst a host of different issues. And that racial bias that we know exists, outright racism that has existed and has been exemplified through countless Black veteran stories, and even our attempts to try to get data to really start to show the public in a more serious way, and be an accountability mechanism as the military moves forward to address these issues. It becomes deeply important. But the Military Justice Improvement Act was really an effort begun by Senator Gillibrand, and it was to address the scourge of sexual assault in the military that hadn't been and still continues to be not dealt with in the ways that it should. And the act essentially would take the equivalent to felony convictions or anything that would require perhaps require 1 year or more of penalty against a particular soldier, Marine, airman, sailor. And it would take it outside of the command purview, right? Because right now, Black vets are twice as or Black service members, are twice as likely in some instances, and in the Air Force, it's even more, to be funneled into this system and be court-martialed, right? That has unyielding repercussions on someone's career. But when you go through the process itself, obviously there are going to be racial disparities in outcomes, which then affect benefit allocation. And so when you talk about wanting to address Black veteran homelessness or just veteran homelessness, right, which Black folk are disproportionately largely overrepresented there. or education gaps, or housing, for instance. All these things are directly tied to the ways in which Black folk are treated, not only when they're recruited, but when they matriculate through their career, and the outcomes there. So the Military Justice Improvement Act it would be a very significant and needed shift, to essentially create an external body to adjudicate these court martials. And it's something that the Secretary of Defense has now signed on to, and a widening margin of congressional leaders are taking lead on, and believe that it's a necessary shift.
So to get more granular and talk a little bit about your service, as a Black veteran yourself, is there anything you feel comfortable sharing with us about examples of racial disparity you might have felt when you were in service? You're a combat veteran or a combat service member. Any examples that you can give us as far as disparities or inequities?
Yeah. So I joined a fairly homogenous unit of mostly white, middle American infantry soldiers. They were very young. We were all young, about to go to war. Most of my colleagues were white. I had maybe 3 or 4, so we were very underrepresented. We had no Black officers. We weren't reflected there either. And there was, for the better part of almost all of the time I was in the military, very uncomfortable race dialogue, and then conservative conspiracy theories, even questioning, the birthplace of Barack Obama, like openly kind of hostile things that we were seeing happening, in the civilian world, but in the military, it just has different implications. And that was one thing. I know I happened to be stationed during my time on a former Nazi base in Germany that had a swastika that was still embedded into the brick. There was a deep infatuation with that. I had service members that I was working with every day that bring Mein Kampf to work and read it. And I don't think that everyone necessarily had like a nefarious kind of racism that undergirded their viewpoint of the world. But there was certainly space made for essentially the training ground or just an indoctrination to potentially take place. And I always use the example of I was in a very small infantry brigade that deployed to Afghanistan. And when I gotten out, about 2 years after I'd gotten out, there was a gentleman who had served. We had actually gone to basic training at the same time, at the same place, and then got stationed in Germany at the same time on this small base in Western Germany, and went to Afghanistan at the same time. He got out and got radicalized, became a neo-Nazi. I got out and started the Black Veterans Project. But he came to New York with the explicit intent of starting a race war by killing a random Black person, and murdered a homeless veteran, actually, a homeless Black veteran in the middle of New York with a sword. So these were, I guess, a more provocative example of something that, I was likely eating in the chow hall with him, or, passing him at the store, the base, the base, the store on base. And it's just, I think for me, it made me realize how close to home everything was, right? And I was a medic, so I was really focused on just making sure people were cared for. But I imagine, just from what I saw, there was a disproportionate level of punishment, a different kind, I think, of approach to dealing with, behavioral issues when it came to minority vets broadly. And then, the military can also read like a bit of a frat, especially in the infantry. And so there's an inner boys club. And oftentimes then you lack mentorship because they're not part of this, usually a homogenous group who are more senior. And I was, very much antagonized. I also served under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So there was multitudes and intersectionalities that play there. But I hope that answers your question, but that's some of what I've seen personally.
And thank you for sharing that. I know that can be tough sometimes. I think the last question I'd love for you to share with all of our members today is, in a perfect world or long-term, what is the one thing you, as the executive director of the Black Veterans Project, would like to see the government or legal services or other nonprofits working towards to address these racial disparities?
Yeah, well, I have a pretty provocative solution. I believe that there should be a Military Civil Rights Act. I think Title VII should apply to members of the military, and it shouldn't be a question. I think there should be something codified in federal law that bars discrimination and allows mechanisms of redress for those that are aggrieved. Right now, something called Faris Doctrine bars service members from being able to levy suit against the military for any host of issues, including medical malpractice, including the mishandling of sexual assaults, and the list can go on and on and on. And I always like to say that racial injustice and racial discrimination is a trauma of its own kind, and can have long-standing not only psychological repercussions but economic as well. And the standing of Faris Doctrine is something that's been slowly being chipped away at, but it's something that without being overturned really gives no one who's been aggrieved a really kind of equitable opportunity to adjudicate it in court and get their justice served. And I just think that something should be codified into federal law that bars discrimination, so you don't have someone like President Trump coming again and deciding by decree that trans service members can't serve, right? I think we are, though we've made a lot of progress in this country, certainly around the racial lines, there's still a long way to go. And I think we'd be remiss with, especially what we've seen in the last few years, to think that the progress that we've made, even around racial lines, can't be drawn back. And the military has to be protected, just like we're, embedding these protections into American institutions writ large.
Richard, thank you so much for sharing and providing really the foundation as we continue to have this conversation today.
Thank you.
Senator Blumenthal, I have a few questions for you. Specifically, we're thrilled that you are able to come here and take some time to talk to us. I was wondering, on a congressional level, Senator Blumenthal, why is it important to address racial justice and inequity in the military, particularly when it comes to veterans accessing benefits?
Well, first, let me thank you and the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center for having this very important forum. Thanks to Liam. Thanks to my wonderful friend, Conley Monk, who is such a hero for me. I've worked with him over many years on this kind of problem, particularly for veterans who were denied honorable discharges and suffered throughout their lives. And he is a living example of how we can make changes in the military and in our veterans system that actually achieve greater justice. And that's why it's important for the military to respond to calls for greater justice. And thanks to Richard Brookshire for his excellent contribution just now. I listened with great interest. He's absolutely right that the military was the first major institution in this country to integrate. Actually, Truman declared that it would be integrated, but Eisenhower, a Republican president, was the one who really enforced it. It took a military hero to make the military listen to the call for justice there. And, it's more than a moral imperative. When we talk about justice in the military, it's also, by the way, really good strategy, really good security policy, because we want to emphasize the importance of talent, bravery, and getting the job done. And lo and behold, equality and equity in the military tend to attract good people of all races and tend to keep them there. That's what we need. And good training. Richard emphasized the importance of opening jobs without regard to race or bias in the military. That's a good human resources policy for any big organization, most of all in the military. So there's another way that it's important. And let me just say, I don't know whether anyone has mentioned it, but to state the obvious, we all know we have our first African-American Secretary of Defense, who is also a very distinguished member of the United States military, four-star general, who now commands our national defense. And he is extremely sensitive to this issue. I can tell you from my private conversations with him, I've had a number before and after his confirmation, and now publicly in hearings. And I will put it to you very bluntly, he described to me in very personal terms the bias and prejudice and sometimes absolutely abhorrent kinds of white supremacy that he saw himself. And his personal experience confirms what we know from the surveys that have been taken, indicating that about a third of all members of our military have seen some evidence of white supremacist insignia or flags or expression in one form or another. So he has made it his mission to, in effect, deter and discourage that kind of white supremacy, because he knows it is bad for good order and discipline. That's, you know, from the military manuals themselves. Good order and discipline demand cohesion, unit cohesion, and people working with each other. So again, from the standpoint just of strategy and security, the kind of measures that we've been discussing here are very, very important to the future of our military. And I might just mention one other point. I don't know what the percentage is of members of the military who are white supremacists or sympathetic to white supremacists or violent extremism. And the Secretary of Defense has said very pointedly, and so has Chairman Milley of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, nobody should be in the military, even if it's just one person. We don't want white supremacists in the military. And we don't want the military enforcing domestic laws as was threatened under Donald Trump as president, because it undermines the good order and discipline of the military, and it is against the doctrines and principles of posse comitatus.
Senator Blumenthal, thank you for that history and talking to us about what the leaders are doing as well. Can you talk to us specifically about what Congress is doing to take corrective action on racial disparities, specifically the disparities that Richard was talking about with access to GI benefits? You know, I know CVLC has talked a lot about veterans with other than honorable discharges and the disparities in getting those discharges. What, broadly speaking, is Congress doing to correct this action?
Well, let me talk very personally about the genesis of the changes, the reforms that were achieved. And you have the hero of this movement on this conference, Conley Monk, who joined with the Yale Legal Services to bring a lawsuit. I learned of the lawsuit. I have a Yale connection because I'm an alumnus. I spent a lot of time there because two of my children were students, and one of them actually was a member of that clinic. And it is really a leader in the country, as is the Yale, Connecticut clinic. And I was very honored to support that lawsuit. So I went to a succession of secretaries of defense, beginning with Ashley Carter, who was very sympathetic, said, we'd like to help. We know that some members of the military are given less than honorable discharges. We know many have been in the past because of PTS, and now some are as well. But as Conley can tell you, during his era, there was no PTS. There was the medical condition of PTS, but nobody had a name for it. Post-traumatic stress. By the way, I don't say post-traumatic stress syndrome or disorder because it's a medical condition. And so nobody knew what brain trauma was as a result of combat. Nobody knew about PTS, and a soldier or a Marine or an airman or a sailor who acted up, as the saying went, acted up, you know, started giving guff to his superior or hers was discipline. And sometimes that discipline resulted in less than honorable discharge. And it had, as I described to Ashley Carter, had a double whammy effect. First, they were ill. Second, they were denied treatment for that illness because they were less than honorably discharged. And the black mark caused them untold suffering, unemployment. Some of them turned to drugs. And so I took this set of facts to Ashley Carter, to Leon Panetta, to Chuck Hagel, finally, who ordered that the policies be changed. But even then, changing the policy on paper was one thing, making it work was another. And I raised this issue in many, many Armed Services Committee hearings. I spoke to a succession of chairmen of the Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin, then John McCain, most recently Jack Reed, and in between them, Jim Inhofe. We need to make that policy work even more effectively. So to answer your question very directly, it is the pressure that we've brought to bear. The litigation was settled. I think there is likely more litigation that may be brought if it hasn't been already, because enforcement of the policies is absolutely critical. And that's where this organization, the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center, can be so impactful, has been so impactful. And I'm very grateful to all that you are doing.
Senator, we are always grateful for your support. For just one last question I have for you. You have been very committed to helping our veterans and veterans with other than honorable discharges in our work. Can you tell us why this is so important to you as our senator?
Well, in one sense, it's a matter of simple justice. You know, someone who raises his or her right hand and in effect vows to give his life for the country also deserves that we keep faith. And that is a principle that runs through all of our treatment of veterans, whether it's veterans education or job training or healthcare or loans. In this instance, a veteran denied justice is more likely to be of color, let's face it. A veteran who is disciplined in the military is more likely to be of color. Now, I want to make absolutely clear that the fact that there's a likelihood doesn't mean it's provable in every case. We don't have statistics on it. I can't go into a court of law and prove it. I'm stating to you what I've heard from many veterans of color. And I want to be fair to the military and say that we need more evidence before we make generalizations that are too sweeping. But the record in the past, in Conley Monk's time, and perhaps even more recently, is that we need to face squarely the need for greater fairness in the military, particularly when it comes to sexual assault. That's the reason why I am strongly supporting Senator Gillibrand's bill. I think there are advances we can make to protect both men and women from sexual assault, taking prosecutions out of the chain of command when it comes to sexual assault and other serious felony crimes. And I think that we need to be mindful as well about the fact that there are still turnaways for health. That is, veterans with less than honorable discharges are turned away from VA healthcare centers. We need to take action on that score. We need to look into disparities in access to vital VA services and benefits. Senator Warnock of Georgia has a bill called the VA Benefits Disparities Bill. I've joined it. Among other things, it would provide additional insight on the scope of those disparities by requiring the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, to study whether disparities associated with race and ethnicity exist, as well as to what extent, regarding access to VA compensation benefits, disability ratings, rejections of claims that veterans may make in other areas. So in terms of the disparate treatment, I mentioned earlier the need for more data and more information. And I want to make absolutely clear in supporting Senator Warnock's bill that I do think we need to be mindful of the need to deal with those potential disparities. And finally, Richard Brookshire mentioned the idea of members of the military having a right to bring legal action for veterans. And that's an area that we should explore as well.
Senator Blumenthal, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for explaining a little bit about the past and what we're doing right now. I really appreciate all of your support here at CVLC. Mr. Monk.
Congratulations on a great event. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Monk, Senator Blumenthal really spoke so poignantly about your impact now, currently, and in the past. And you are a veteran that has kept the faith. Can you tell me a little bit about, as a Vietnam veteran, what you experienced and what led you to your class action and subsequently forming NVCLR?
His mic is on mute.
Oh. Conley, I think you just have to hit the little microphone that says unmute. You know what, Conley, we're going to try to do this on our end. Give us 1 second. Steve, can you unmute him? Okay, I think we're having a little technical difficulty. So Liam, we are going to move on to what we have been investigating at CVLC. Senator Blumenthal has laid the foundation for what Congress is doing, and Richard Brookshire. Oh, hi, Conley.
Yes. Hello. I apologize for the complications and the delay, but I would like to say that I'm honored and it's a pleasure to be here. And I also would like to throw something back at Senator Blumenthal. You know, Senator Blumenthal has been a champion for veterans, not only for me, for veterans. And he have assisted us with working with the vets and working with Yale to make sure that we have been able to address the issues of the vets with the less than honorable discharges. Now, your question was, when I came back from Vietnam, I was kind of angry, you know, because I didn't feel that I deserved it, a less than honorable discharge. In light of me given an honorable service in Vietnam fighting, and I yield to the call of my country. That's what led me to start the National Veterans Council for Legal Redress. I realized it wasn't only me. After doing a lot of research, I found that it was like 800,000 veterans coming back with bad papers from the Vietnam era war. So I know that a lot of my friends and my family members of color was coming back with bad discharges. I also know that there was discrimination in the military. I had bad experiences, like I was stationed in Camp Lejeune, and when I come off the base, right outside the base, you had to go on the other side of the street. You couldn't go to the same stores, you couldn't use the, and then this was in the 60s. So I know I realized it was a lot of things going on during that time, but the military, I always thought was a fair institution. It was, supposed to be just, but it was unjust. So I experienced a lot of bad things in the military, especially after I came back from Vietnam. So I felt the need to start the National Veterans Council. And what we did was we got involved with Yale, and we was able to use Yale uh, to provide legal services for our veterans. I knew at that time that it was a great importance to me to fight for the other veterans, even though I had a bad discharge. It took me 45 years before I was able to get my discharge upgraded. But I was fighting for vets way before my discharge was upgraded. I knew that it was just totally unjust that veterans was treated so unfairly after yielding to the call of the country. My father was a World War II vet, so it was a passion that I had. I felt that it was my duty as a citizen to fight for my country, the country that I love, my family loved. So we continue our fight, the National Veterans Council. And with the help of Senator Blumenthal and with Yale, uh, it makes it a lot easier for us.
Now, Conley, you are a tremendous support to the work we do at CVLC. Can you talk to those in the audience a little bit about what a bad paper discharge is and how that made you feel as a veteran in your personal identity? And then when you got a discharge upgrade, how you felt as a veteran?
Well, the bad paper put a stigma on the veterans with a less than honorable discharge. It prohibited us from getting jobs. Now, we went in the military to be a productive citizen. We came home and was unable to provide for our families. My family suffered because my kids wasn't able to use the educational GI Bill, neither was I. So I had to work 2 jobs in order to support my family. Bad papers, it doesn't sound like it's a whole lot to one that hasn't received it, but it was a long time scar. It was one that I suffered for many years. And my family was even disappointed in me when I came home. My father was a World War II vet, honorable discharge. My sister went in 1 month before I did. She was a Vietnam era. She came back with honorable discharge. So my family was of military. Another brother that was in doing Grenada. Another brother was a Vietnam era. So that discharge really hurted me, and I know that it hurted my family. So how I felt when I received it and upgraded my discharge, I felt like I had a lot of weight that was lifted off me. It granted me the opportunity to use the VA, which I never used before. I only started using the VA 3 years ago. And I've been home from Vietnam ever since 1970. So, that discharge was something that granted me relief financially. I was able to buy a house with the assistance of the funds that I received from the VA. And once again, without the support of Senator Blumenthal and Yale, I got to give Mike Wishnick a lot of credit, because Mike, see, I was with Yale ever since the 70s, but every time a new student would graduate, they would drop my case. So I went through the Discharge Review Board, the Naval Correctional Military Records, and that discharge upgrade was a God's gift to me. You know, it's like something that I prayed for many years. And I would like to commend my wife, because she stood right there by my side, and she helped me every step of the way. So I know how other veterans feel in getting their discharges upgraded. And I have to say to other veterans, don't give up, keep fighting. And that's what I tell vets when I'm working with them. You know, it might be a hard and a long fight, but it will be worth it in the long run. Just keep on fighting, don't give up. So I hope I answered the question.
You absolutely did. And I think that's so poignant. We work with veterans, especially the practice group for discharge upgrade, where it is hard work to do a discharge upgrade. Millie Vandenbroek, our attorney here, is working with them over and over again. And to hear from a veteran who has gone through the process, Mr. Monk, not to give up, I think is really important for all veterans, especially those, like in your case, that are living with PTSD and really were unjustly given bad papers. So thank you for sharing your story here today. I think you've affected the veterans that are looking to get discharge upgrades, and I know you've been pivotal to our practice. I have one last question for you. NVCLR and you built a beautiful monument in New Haven to commemorate the Vietnam War. Can you tell us what led you to build this beautiful monument?
Well, when I came home from Vietnam, you know, we was shined upon as a negatively. You know, we was baby killers, we was rapists, you know, we wasn't looked upon very, very good. And when I came home, there was nothing being done for the Vietnam vets. You know, most of us had to go out and fight for what we thought that we was entitled to. So what inspired me to build the monument, I got involved with, I knew a lot of vets that got killed in Vietnam, that was killed in Vietnam. So I got involved with their family members. I got involved with their mothers, their fathers, sisters, brothers. And so I felt the need to form a committee. And what I did was I compiled my committee of the family members of the Vietnam vets, the deceased Vietnam vets. And so we had a very powerful committee. At that time, when I thought of it in the 70s, but in the 80s, when Mayor DeLito was in office, I went to him and we put forth a proposal, and he granted every request that we put together. An office location, he gave us in City Hall in New Haven. We asked for office equipment. And at that time, you didn't have cell phones, had landline phones. So we had to request a phone, and the city paid for that. We requested $15,000 from the city to initiate, to get started with our monument project. Now, what we wanted to do, we was granted 2 locations where we could build our monument. One was El Grasso Boulevard and Orange Avenue. The other was the Long Wharf. The reason why we chose the Long Wharf, because the Long Wharf was more accessible. It was more visible. At that time, the highway wasn't elevated. And if you was going to Hartford, if you was coming into New England, you had to come past our monument. So, you know, also where we chose to build the monument, if you look directly through it, took you right straight back to Vietnam. It was ideal. So, you know, we then decided that we wanted to include 7 cities. the 7 surrounding cities. And so we did that. I went to each one of the mayors and selectmen of each city and requested that they give us $15,000, same as New Haven gave us, and they did grant us that. We was on our way then. So, the only thing that we didn't complete, at the time that we requested to build this monument, we also wanted to include the living Vietnam vets. At that time, we had came up with a design of the V and a 4-foot wall around the V. It included all of the living Vietnam veterans' names from the 7 cities. And let me tell you that it was a rewarding project. I was there when they brought the stone in. They dug the hole in the ground. It was anchored 11 feet deep. The monument's 11 feet tall, and it's estimated to be up for 2,000 years. It was a rewarding project. And every day, I thank God that He gave me the energy to see it through. I'm going back to try to fight for the living Vietnam vets. So that's the monument project.
Can I make a comment, Ashley? Just a very quick comment, and I really apologize for interrupting the flow of your program, but Conley's comments, his very eloquent description of his personal experience, should remind us, number one, we need outreach to veterans, particularly veterans who have less than honorable discharge. Very often, the stigma and shame discourage them from coming forward, even though they can get some redress through the process that exists now. I will tell you, one of the challenges for me is to convince the Department of Defense that it should be doing more outreach, and the VA that it should be doing outreach. Number two, Conley's experience doesn't attest to this point necessarily, but someone who was less strong than Conley might well have contemplated pretty drastic measures. And we know that the rate of veteran suicide is still way too high, whether it's 20 or 22 or whoever is taking their own lives, it is an intolerably high number. Again, outreach. And I've been very critical of the VA because it has failed to use the money that we appropriated to do outreach. I think under this new administration, Dennis McDonough is going to do a much better job, has been doing a much better job, and we can be thankful that he's in that job. And third, I know that Conley was denied use of the VA facility in West Haven, as well as Newington. The VA provides really quality medical care, but it needs to rebuild those facilities to provide for the increasing number of men and, yes, women. The VA facility in West Haven now has a much better women's clinic, health clinic, than before. But again, women have to be regarded as part of the population to be reached for inclusion and equity. Inclusion and equity. So this point is very important, as well as for the LGBTQ community, inclusion and equity, racial inclusion and equity. I think we've been focusing mainly on it, but let's not forget about the other ways that the military has to be more inclusive and equitable. And I will just close with this thought, that we happen to have the greatest military in the history of the world, and just a lot of really good people, good, decent people who don't have, a white supremacist bone in their body. So I don't want to be misunderstood as painting too broad a brush here. The reason for hope and for positivity, I think, is that we have a Secretary of Defense and everybody under him committed to making a difference on these issues.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. And I know at CVLC, we are very happy to hear that more outreach will be done at the VA. I think we are even more excited to hear that the VA will be training their staff to make sure that all veterans are given due process and that we don't see turnaways at the degree we're seeing them. So very important issues. I'm really thrilled that you jumped right in here, especially after what Tommy said. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's a good segue to talk a little bit about what CVLC has been doing as a project and our executive director has been doing as a project on racial disparities in military discharges. So focusing a little bit back on the back end when you are discharged, how that bad paper discharge then affects your ability to get VA benefits, and also a little bit about the Turnaway Project and how we don't want to be turning away any veterans because of their discharge status. So Liam, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to in this project and sort of the background on how your FOIA came about?
Sure, Ashley. Thank you so much for that question. And thank you to everyone on this panel. I'm so honored to join this incredible group of advocates who are out there. All your insight has been phenomenal. You mentioned, and Senator Blumenthal mentioned, the turnaway issue that we've been working on. That is a separate issue that has been a really big focus of, and continues to be a focus of our work, that a number of veterans who do qualify for health care continually get turned away from the VA because even though the VA gives fantastic care, a number of people administering admittance to the VA are unaware of some of the rules that grant extensions of benefits to some veterans who have less than honorable discharges or might qualify for care under different provisions. And so that's been an ongoing work of ours, and Senator Blumenthal has been a great ally in doing that. We really appreciate that. But another thing, as you mentioned, Ashley, is looking at racial disparities in other than honorable discharges or in discharges in general. And if I can, I'm going to share some slides to kind of talk about how we got here to look at this issue. Everything we do at CVLC, we start from our mission statement, which the mission of the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center is to overcome the legal barriers to housing, healthcare, and income for veterans recovering from homelessness and mental illness. That's the mission we were founded with, and that's how we start all of the work that we do. And we want all our work to be client-focused or client-inspired. And we learned early on in doing this work that in order to overcome a number of these barriers, we needed to focus on military discharges and the impact of military discharges and what those discharges had on the veterans we serve. And so the question is why? Now, I know for a lot of people on this webinar today, we have folks from all different levels of knowledge base around this issue. So we have great veterans advocates who are steeped in the legalese of veteran discharges and their legal impacts on our clients and veterans out there in general. But we also have a number of folks from foundations or just people who want to learn about these issues. So I'm going to give a very brief, very high level overview of why this matters. I'm going to cut out all nuance to just give the really high level of how military discharges affect veterans and what impact they can have. In general, there are 5 discharges that a service member leaving the military can get. That's the honorable, general under honorable conditions, other than honorable, bad conduct, and dishonorable. The first 2, if you have an honorable or general, you are eligible for VA income supports and health care if you need them. But under the other 3 discharges, veterans are presumptively ineligible for benefits and health care. And for other than honorable discharges, these are discharges that people receive administratively outside the military justice system. So there's been a lot of look at justice systems, and the military justice system is one that deserves further examination. And there are certain issues of due process that go along there. But other than honorable discharges can occur completely outside the system and have very little due process protection. And they can have significant impacts for veterans, because if I just go back, you will be presumptively ineligible for healthcare or income supports from the VA unless you prove otherwise. And this is a key and a lot of the legal work that we've done on behalf of clients over the years. There are two primary ways of legal remedies to address this. One is through the VA, where a veteran can make the case through a characterization of discharge process that they are honorable for VA purposes, and that even though they might have a other than honorable discharge or a bad conduct, that they should be considered, excuse me, should be considered honorable and receive all the benefits from the VA. The other method is through the Department of Defense, through what's called a discharge upgrade, where the Department of Defense relooks at a veteran's discharge and effectively changes it completely, and the veteran then has either honorable or a general and can get access to the VA for healthcare. And that's what Conley was talking about. He's just been a leader in litigating this issue and bringing this issue to the fore. But in taking on these cases, we've seen a number of systemic problems over our 13 years in existence. The first being that other honorable discharges in the post 9/11 era have seen explosive growth. It's hugely different than what it was in the past. So if we look at the World War I era, under 1% of veterans at that time had other than honorable discharges. But today, in post 9/11 era, it's close to 6% of veterans that are living today have other than honorable discharges. And so we have a lot more veterans who are outside the veterans benefit system, presumptively blocked from care. The second thing that we have seen consistently is that there are a lack of practitioners to help veterans make these cases, particularly when there are mental health issues involved. Sometimes gathering the evidence that a veteran should be qualified as honorable for VA purposes or should get a discharge upgrade, it takes a lot of work. It takes legal expertise. And although there's a very passionate and tight-knit community of veteran advocates in the rest of the world, people are oblivious to this. And so we see this with legal aids around the country. Many of them do not know that this is a legal intervention that can really make life-changing impact and give somebody healthcare for life or income supports for life that can move them from poverty to sustainability if they can make their case. And so one of the things we've really tried to do and want to do is raise awareness about these issues. And one of the ways we're doing it is this month, the American Bar Association is publishing the Military Discharge Upgrade Manual. We've produced a legal practice manual that our own Margaret Kuzma has led the effort writing and assembling this with a team of attorneys from the Legal Services Center at Harvard to bring these tools to other practitioners nationwide to help make these interventions. And so the manual will be shipping in mid-August. So we hope that will help increase the bar of folks who can practice and help veterans evolve. But the third thing we've seen in our own anecdotal experience and through the experiences of the clients that we work with is that there are racial disparities that underlie the discharges that exist. Our own experience is that our veteran clients with other than honorable discharges are disproportionately veterans of color. Our allies at Protect Our Defenders did a few years ago a great investigation of racial disparities in the military justice system. And you can see how with bad conduct and dishonorable discharges, the racial disparities play out there. But we also are finding even administratively, there are, we believe, racial disparities. And this is how we came around to this investigation, because the problem is there are no updated statistics on this issue. And so it's something that we thought it was important for us to investigate and look into.
So Leon, when we just decided and figured there wasn't data on this, what did we do as a program to try to get data?
Yeah, so we've talked to a number of other organizations about it. We did a bunch of research, and we would talk, I feel like, with other veteran advocates, fairly common knowledge that it does seem to be racial disparities there, but sometimes get pressed for the data. So we decided we need to find the data ourselves. And so, just give me a second, one of the things we did was initiate a Freedom of Information Act investigation. And I can share with you a bit of what we're finding out there. It's still an ongoing investigation, but what we did is we sent Freedom of Information Act requests to the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard to get discharges broken out by ethnic and racial background according to the data that each service branch collects and keeps over a 5-year time period to see what the reality is today. So a lot of people talk about the great progress that the military has made and the great progress that our society has made. And these things are all true. But as Richard was talking about, there's still a lot to be done. And what we wanted to see is what is the current data now. And so we've gotten some feedback, and I'm going to share with you some of the data that we've gotten, but I want to give a few data caveats at the moment. First, the different service branches use all different sorts of racial classifications. It's not uniform across the branches. So I'll talk about them with some of the language that they use. It might not be the language I would choose to use, and it won't be uniform. We'll look at the Navy and Marines today. Secondly, for Latinx or Latino veterans, in looking at discharges, the military at least collects data on Latino veterans as an ethnicity or a variety of ethnicities and not as a racial classification, although at least the Army uses it as a racial classification when talking about their general demographics. So at the moment, we don't actually have really good data there, and so that data isn't very clear at the moment, and there's a problem with the data there. And then there's a number of individuals who either have declined to respond to the military or the military marks them as unknown. So that's been excluded from what we're talking about. But at the moment, we have full responses from the Marines, full responses from the Navy, a partial response from the Army. The Air Force has denied our requests. We're currently appealing that. And the Coast Guard has not yet responded with this data. But what we do have, we have some preliminary findings. And what we can see with our preliminary findings is that what we see is a significant systemic anti-Black bias in the data around discharges from the Marines and the Navy, and a notable systemic pro-white bias as well. And what that means, I'll talk about in a second. When looking at this, there's kind of two ways to break down the data. Is one, looking at each racial classification as defined by the service branch and how many of those folks end up with other than honorable discharges. And the other is to look at discharges in general and how they're dispersed amongst each group. So we look at other than honorable discharges in the Navy. For each group, the share of their group that received a other than honorable discharge, you see a significantly larger share of Black veterans with other than honorable discharges. 6.1% of Black veterans in the last 5 years have received an other than honorable discharge in the Navy, whereas from amongst white veterans, it's less than 3%. So that's over twice as many, sorry. When you look at the Marines, you see the same thing. 8.8% of Black Marine veterans have other than honorable discharges. Excuse me. Less than 5% of the other racial classifications have other than honorable discharges. So we see a significant anti-Black bias in this area. Then if you look at the way discharges break down across the board and across racial classifications, their share of other than honorable discharges, you see both a significant anti-Black bias and a notable pro-white bias. And what I mean there is, over all discharges from the Navy, Black veterans make up about 18.5% of all discharges, but they make up 33% of all other than honorable discharges. Similarly, white veterans from the Navy, white sailors, account for 65% of all discharges, but only 52% of other than honorable discharges. Another way to look at this is to look at a graph like this, where you see that Black sailors leaving the Navy, Black naval veterans, has 14.8 points higher rate of other than honorable discharges. If there was a proportionality amongst the groups for all discharges and other than honorable discharges, the number should be around 0. And you see that with American Indian and Alaska Native veterans, Asian veterans, and multiracial veterans. But for Black veterans, they're much more higher rates of other than honorable discharges. And for white veterans, you have almost the exact opposite on the flip side, much lower rates than other than honorable discharges. And so they're very lopsided. Finally, with Marines, you see the same thing. It's almost exactly a mirror image where every other racial group hovers around the 0 line. But Black veterans have an 8-point higher percentage of other than honorable discharges, and white veterans have a negative 7-point percentage of other than honorable discharges. So these racial disparities are really playing out in discharges today, and we can see that in the data that we're receiving. And so we're waiting to collect the data from the other branches and see how that plays out as well.
Yeah, these are really good data points. What does this concretely mean to the veterans that we serve and the veterans here on this panel, or the veterans and the people that the nonprofits on this panel are serving? What does all of this data mean for all of us?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, the military has come a long way, like our whole society has come a long way. But even now, we have real racial disparities in the discharge process. And these racial disparities in the discharge process mean racial disparities in access to benefits and access to supports. And so it has real effects on people's lives. And so we're looking to help veterans and veteran advocates use this data to lower the barriers to housing, healthcare, and income for veterans.
What is the one thing you would like everyone to leave knowing or doing today with all of this data?
Well, I think if the stories people have heard today speaks to audience members, I think there are a number of ways folks can get involved in this. For funders, I mean, at least from CVLC's end, and I'm sure the other panelists have other ideas as well, but for funders, for us, we're going to need assistance publishing and distributing a report on this data when it's all finished. And that's something I think that's going to be really important to push this conversation forward. And for practitioners, if this speaks to you, I mean, I would say take on a VA benefits case or discharge upgrade case, or help litigate some of these FOIA requests, because we might need to do appeals and we'd be open to pro bono assistance there. So there are many ways for folks to get involved, and we would love to see people get involved.
I think we've had an engaging audience, which is always a good sign of interested panel. I have 2 questions for Senator Blumenthal. Senator Blumenthal, if you wouldn't mind answering some questions. I think we might have lost connection with Senator Blumenthal. We will have to get those in writing. I would like to thank everyone today for taking an hour and 15 minutes out of your busy day to really put this issue front and center. It is critical to us. It is critical to everybody on this panel. It is critical to our service members and to our veterans. And if a topic speaks to you and you feel compelled, we really encourage you to get involved in our pro bono work or in the work that Richard Brookshire is doing with storytelling and pushing advocacy forward, or the work that Conley Monk is doing on his level, to really make sure that this veteran racial injustice stays front and center. And we just applaud Senator Blumenthal for keeping this front and center in Connecticut and also the nation. So thank you all very much for joining us, and we really appreciate it. We hope you have a great day.